This week on To the Contrary,
safety concerns, as at least 6 women have severe side effects, one of them dying after getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Then, fighting sexual and domestic violence on a number of fronts.
Welcome to the Contrary. I'm Bonnie Urbay. Up first this week, women and the COVID vaccine.
Injections of the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine were paused this week for the FDA and CDC to review data on 6 women who got blood clots within 2 weeks of being inoculated. One of the women died, and the second one is in critical condition at the time of this taping. The women were between 18 and 49 years old, with nearly 7 million doses administered, 1 million of them to women under the age of 50. Health experts still believe the J&J vaccine risk of blood clots is tiny, but just what percentage of the trial participants were women? 15% of the U.S. participants in the J&J trial were Hispanic or Latinx, 13% Black and African American, and 6% Asian American. Pfizer and Moderna had similar percentages for Blacks and Asian Americans, but a higher percentage of Hispanics. Trials on pregnant women are now underway, and much of the research reportedly is positive for the mother and also the babies. Pregnant and lactating women were not initially included. With us today are former judge and federal prosecutor Debra Carnahan, Patrice Onwuka of the Independent Women Voices, Genevieve Wood of the Heritage Foundation, and Dr. Avis Jones-DeWeever, co-founder of Max Black Media.
Hello, Dr. DeWeever. Was postponing the use of the J&J vaccine a good idea from the perspective of women who might be afraid to be taking any vaccine?
You know, this was a hard call. Obviously, it may have some impacts when it comes to vaccine hesitancy. But I do think that it is a good sign that we are letting science lead the way. And in an abundance of caution, it makes sense to just take a closer look at this, to do everything that we can to make sure that we save lives versus having something come up that might cut lives short out of, unintentional consequences. But
anybody jump in here? Who's the villain here? Is it the fact that women are under-tested in drug trials, including in vaccine trials? We don't have full data yet, but the data do show from earlier studies that women are under-tested on this vaccine. And of course, we know the difference between testosterone in men and body weight, and then estrogen in women and progesterone are really make differences in how people react to drugs. Anyone jump in? Genevieve.
Well, I would say the real villain here is COVID-19, Bonnie. I mean, that's the problem. And we had something that was killing a lot of Americans and a lot of people around the world. And we quickly had to act to find a vaccine. By all counts and measures, I think what was done in terms of developing the vaccine was right. Yes, we should be cautious, but thank goodness we have 3 or 4 other versions that men and women can be taking as well. So I think the concern is we have to be very careful. As Dr. DeWeever said, that we don't want to get into mixed messaging. We've been very hard trying to encourage more people to get vaccinated so that we can all move on. And so we want to be very careful that we don't communicate vaccines aren't safe, whether it be for COVID-19 or many others. So it's fine, I think, to take a pause here, but we have to keep in mind these were 6 individuals out of
7 million.
Yeah, right.
So even advocates of using the vaccine and even people who believe in science, now that an administration that believes in science is back running the country, even some of those people are saying this was so infinitesimal, it was stupid to pause its use.
It's very important for people to trust that our government is not hiding anything. It's not hiding any side effects. And we don't need for more women to die to say, oh, wow, we probably should have halted it. Also, there is a lot of the other two vaccines. And though it may delay by a couple weeks, some people getting the vaccine to keep, their good practices and masks and social distancing in place till they can get their second dose or first dose is not that much of a hardship to ask versus losing another woman's life until we know more.
Well, the funny thing is, Bonnie, women have been much more receptive to the vaccine than men. It seems like men, particularly young men, have been the ones who've been most hesitant and frankly resistant to take it. And so pausing the J&J vaccine, which is it's a single dose, so it's easier, more likely to be distributed in doctors' offices and schools potentially in the future. Those are exactly the people that we want to target, young people. So I actually disagree. I think it should not have been paused. I think it should continue with full transparency. And we still don't even know in the cases of the 6 people, the one of whom passed, if there were other factors. Maybe they had underlying health conditions that contributed far more to their death than this vaccine. I think it's critically important. And looking at my Facebook feed, I'm speaking from the people I know in my lives. It's the young men, particularly the young men of color, who say, "Oh, there you go, more evidence that these vaccines are deadly and should not be used on anyone."
Do we think that the vaccine companies and that the FDA required enough testing by gender and enough women represented, people of color? Apparently Latinx are much more likely to have complications than other groups of people. Why didn't they test for gender and race?
This is a sad situation with testing anyway, not just with this vaccine, but with the rollout of drugs in this country, period. We typically have women who are underrepresented in trials. We typically have Black people and other people of color who are underrepresented in trials. And the situation was so unique in that you had this worldwide epidemic that needed to be addressed as quickly as possible, that even under the best situations, we would not have largely had the level of representation that we would have wanted. And under this expedited sense, we definitely didn't. But your point here that you made previously, Bonnie, I think is very important for people to get. This has impacted less than 1 in a million people. 1 in a million people, less than 1 in a million people have suffered the deleterious effects that they have paused the distribution of this vaccine for. And it makes me that more confident in this government and this administration to say that they are not trying to hide this, that they are doing this even with this very infinitesimal impact, negative impact, that they are going out of their way to make sure that they are being as safe as possible with it. This makes me trust them more moving forward rather than trust them less.
Last year, we saw a lot of weaponization of the development of these vaccines in general. And it's unfortunate that during a presidential campaign, you had candidates, particularly who are now in office, saying they wouldn't trust the development of vaccines if it was under the current president. So I think some of that fed into, some of the hesitancy we're seeing today, and it's unfortunate. And I do think maybe that contributed to why you didn't see as many people participating in the vaccine trials. But I do hope to see more people of color and more women represented in the future.
I understand why that lack of trust was there. I mean, let's not just gloss over the fact that the previous administration told well over 30,000 documented lies until they stopped counting them. And so there is a reason why there wasn't trust there. However, this is exactly why this administration is such a stark contrast, because if this would have happened, I'll be honest with you, under the previous administration, we probably wouldn't have known. This is the administration that allowed over 500,000 people to die because they didn't address this issue directly. So there was a reason for that lack of trust. It didn't just come out of the ether.
But let me throw in one last possibility. What if the government had said, we're not stopping the distribution of J&J, particularly let's remember that underserved countries, that was where most of that vaccine was going to go to. We're just going to tell you that there's less than a 1 in a million chance as a woman that you will develop blood clots, and there might be difficult scenarios after that. We have lost one woman to this situation. We don't really know what caused it, except that she was one of 6 with blood clot reactions to the vaccine out of about 7 million people who were administered. Why not do it that way?
Or why not just allow men to get the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and tell women they can't have it until further notice?
Right. I mean, that's another very, very good idea that wouldn't have thrown everything into this big sort of panic mood of, oh my God,
Bonnie, I think we have to keep in mind, this has been a very unusual past year where from the very get-go, there was so much that we didn't know. I'm not going to say the last administration, I think I'm very thankful for. They're the reason we actually have the vaccines in the first place. And secondly, the lying started with the Chinese. And from the get-go, all of our leaders, including Dr. Fauci and others on the science front, they didn't know all the answers either. And they have talked out of both sides of their mouth multiple times. And I'm not saying that they did that on purpose. It's because many times people were asked questions that frankly, they didn't have the real solid answers to yet. And because of that, I think people are, including this administration now, something like this comes out and they're just worried. What if we say the wrong thing now? And look, I think the evidence so far scientifically would say we shouldn't have stopped it and that we should allow people to continue to take it. But again, thankfully, there are multiple versions out there. Millions of Americans now have had at least one dose, and most and the elderly population, both doses. So we're headed in the right direction. I think we should just keep heading that way and not try to lay blame at anybody's feet.
All right. From the COVID vaccine in women to ending sexual assault.
The Biden administration is addressing sexual assault in the military and in schools. The Department of Education announced it will hold public hearings on how schools should handle sexual misconduct cases. It's the first step in a planned overhaul of the Title IX regulations. Also, despite top military officials pledging zero tolerance, they continue to oppose overhauling the military system for trying sexual assault. But that could be changing given new signals from the White House and increased focus on sexual assault, that following the Me Too movement. One woman, an award-winning filmmaker who survived intimate sexual violence, told, to the contrary, domestic and sexual violence are hard to address.
It's been hard for victims and survivors to talk about. The details are embarrassing, they're humiliating, but I feel that the more people talk about their experiences with domestic violence, the closer we can get to understanding the scope of the problem and also to finding solutions. The pandemic has only heightened this crisis, where we saw around the world victims being stuck in lockdown with their abusers, and in fact, domestic violence incidences rising all over the world.
Tanya Selvaratnam wrote, Assume Nothing, a story of intimate violence. Selvaratnam writes about the abuse in her relationship with former New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. It included isolation, manipulation, and sex that turned violent. She was shocked because Schneiderman was a women's rights advocate involved in the investigation of producer Harvey Weinstein, the case that kicked off the Me Too movement. Several women have stepped forward with similar charges against him.
Even fierce women get abused. Abusers are of all stripes. I was with somebody who public-facing was a feminist, an advocate for vulnerable communities, but privately he abused me. And he is, I say, the fruit, not the root of this type of behavior. It's the conditioning by the patriarchy to normalize the cycle of violence from the time that we are born. And part of my book is my part to burn down the patriarchy.
Schneiderman was never charged criminally, but the case prompted the proposal of new legislation. Selvaratnam's book includes resources that we will post on the To the Contrary website as part of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is April.
So Debra Carnahan, with Title IX, what should be the first steps?
First of all, I want to applaud the Biden administration for addressing this head on. There's so many issues that they could take up, but obviously this is near and dear to the president's heart because he worked on this issue when he was vice president in redoing guidelines. There's so many things that need to be done, but one of them has to do with the fact that the victims are allowed through a third party to be able to cross-examine the people that they are accusing of this crime. To not be able to cross-examine really ties your hands behind your back. It's just one person's word against the other, prepared statements. So I think that's a huge point that they want to change. The other thing that I really do like is they're asking for input from educators, from students, from people who have been sexually assaulted on campuses and what their experience has been. So I think those are really three strong points that the Biden administration is doing right now.
How should it be dealt with in schools?
Well, Bonnie, I would like to say that, I think the previous administration did something important when it comes to how cases are handled on campuses. Number one, this assumption of innocence, moving moving it back to the situation where if you are accused, you're not suddenly just accused and tried and found guilty right away, but it's at least you're given some sort of fairness and a presumption of innocence. And then, I think there are other measures that were taken to at least give those students who have been accused, particularly male students, the right to be able to defend themselves. You don't have to take away the rights of the victims in the situation, but you also want to ensure that there's a balance and there's fairness on both parts. And I hope that the Biden administration wouldn't do anything to erode those changes.
Okay, but should that be applied similarly in universities and in high schools, or is there, given an age difference, should there be greater protections for women who come out and make allegations of sexual assault, like in high school rather than college?
Well, I would think that high school students, as long as you're underage, that's certainly a different standard. When you're 18 and above and are able to make decisions for yourself as an adult and a thinking adult, I think then the situation is a little bit different. But to treat high school students and college students differently, or treat them the same, I see some pitfalls there.
What about? Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think it's important to protect the accuser and the accused, both.
Yeah.
And I do think there should be a presumption of innocence. We should not change that standard, but it is an administrative type proceeding. We're not in a court of law. So we have to be very, very careful to protect the accuser from ramifications, identity issues until it is worked out. And I think there needs to be some protections put in place. For example, what if the accused and the accuser are in the same classroom, and they have to continue their classes? What should be the course? Should they have to Zoom in, and not show up until it can be resolved so they're not physically in the same room together? Those things need to be addressed.
Boy, there are so many, when you think about it, there are so many details like that you couldn't possibly, in advance protect against every single situation that could come up, correct?
Right. But it is important to look at it in that context because in schools, you are in a very, very tight area and will run into each other. So that does need to be addressed as to how to allow the victim accuser from not having to constantly see and be around this person, and also keep their anonymity.
What about,
Bonnie,
let's switch now to the military sexual assault. Now, I remember Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat of New York, when she was one of the early contenders for president, and she dropped out early on. But she was trying to change the federal and military sexual assault to take it out of the chain of command. In other words, if your commanding officer did something, sexually assaulted you, and then you have to go back to that person and complain about it, isn't that kind of ridiculous? But her amendment was defeated. So should we do something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. When that came up back then, and we discussed it on your show, and I know Claire McCaskill, the former senator from Missouri, who was on the Armed Services Committee, took a very strong stand on this as well, because the past has not worked. Going up the chain of command has not worked. So the system that the military has in place needs to be revamped. It needs to be taken to some sort of civilian tribunal that gets it out of the rank and file. And then whatever the tribunal would decide, then the commanders and the chain of command would have to abide by.
Okay, let's switch for a moment to Matt Getz. Now, should he be charged with prostitution and sex trafficking? And if this is still going on at these levels of government, what is it going to take to end it?
My goodness.
Well, it's going to take a lot to end it.
Absolutely.
Avis, go ahead, but take try to take have a response to that, because it's an important question. You're in Congress, you're dealing with sexual trafficking. I mean, come on.
Well, it takes consequences. Number one, it takes consequences. And even beyond, the sex trafficking is like way beyond the pale. So this isn't, it's an accusation. He hasn't been charged yet. We don't know, but we also heard that he was actually showing pictures of women that he had relationships with, naked pictures of women that he had relationships with, to other Congress people on the floor of the House. How has he not been expelled? How has that not been something that his colleagues took him to task for?
Well, there's a new sheriff in town, Doctor.
I'm sorry? Didn't hear you?
There's a new sheriff in town now. And, yes, the House was controlled still by the Democrats when this was happening. When you look to the Ethics Committee, and certainly internally in Congress, right? We have our own ability there to do our own policing through the Ethics Committee and have him be brought up on ethics charges and have them look into it, that might result in his losing committee seat assignments or even being expelled from Congress.
Absolutely. But what I'm suggesting is that his colleagues, how is it that no one in his circle of colleagues, I guess maybe he knew who to show it to, but how is it that no one in his circle of colleagues, the other Republicans, let me be very specific, who he showed them to, how come none of them had the moral fiber to say, this is wrong, this is disgusting, and I am not going to sit here and rubber stamp it by keeping my mouth closed and having this go on without you being able to be taught to task in terms of consequences? If Nancy Pelosi doesn't know about it, for example, it's nothing she can do about it, but the people that he showed it to knew it. How is that all of them are morally bereft? That is a problem.
All right, but again, going back to your earlier point, he has not yet been convicted. I mean, just because even if this case goes to trial, that's not enough yet to throw him out of Congress. Doesn't he have to be convicted first?
Well, ask Al Franken that question.
Yeah, no, he doesn't have to be convicted first in a court of law to be thrown out of Congress, to be censured, to be stripped of committee assignments, pending a criminal outcome. I mean, they can expel him from Congress if the Ethics Committee recommends that.
I agree with you about taking away committee assignments, et cetera, but and I'm not saying that this is a legal requirement, but a moral requirement. You don't want to see him convicted first. Obviously, the former senator you referred to, Avis, left because his party pressured the heck out of him to leave. And there was a lot of talk afterwards that maybe what he did didn't amount to something that should have cost him his Senate seat. But
absolutely. So this example is exactly what I'm talking about. When we saw what happened with Al Franken, he did not go through the whole process, but it was because he was under peer pressure, whether you agree with it or not. I don't happen to have agreed with it personally, but whether you agree with it or not, he was under peer pressure that was set by the moral standard of his party. And what I'm saying is that I don't see any moral standard when it comes to the Republican Party, which is why Getz still has his position today.
That is an interesting question, why Democrats jumped in so quickly on Franken, and we don't see any Republicans so far saying that Getz must resign. But I assume that'll, if he gets prosecuted, that'll happen next. But anyway, thank you all. That's it for this edition. Thank you, Debra Carnahan and Dr. Avis Jones-DeWeever and Patrice Lee of the Independent Women's Voices and Genevieve Wood. So we'll see you all again soon. And that's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please follow us on our PBS webpage, which is www.tothecontrary.org. And please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next time.